Yeah, when you really look back into the post-World War II, Gloomy Sunday, a song by Rezo Seres, caused lots of suicide. It is often referred to as the Hungarian suicide song. It starts in 1993, when Hungarian composer Rezo Seres broke up with his girlfriend on a Sunday. In utter despair, he pens Gloomy Sunday. The first publisher rejects his song as too depressing. The second commits suicide. But the third sees the potential and publishes Gloomy Sunday throughout Europe. People start dying immediately. In Berlin, a man shot himself after telling relatives he couldn't get the damn song out of his head. In Rome, an errand boy heard a beggar humming the tune, got off his bike, gave the beggar all his money, and jumped from the nearest bridge. In 1 year alone in Hungary, 17 suicides were found with notes quoting the Gloomy Sunday lyrics. Of course, skeptics dismiss these claims as anecdotal, quoting the rather strange fact that Hungary was so well known for its high suicide rate that 17 people found dead in 1 year clutching the lyrics to a song was par for the course. In 1936, the song reached New York and was marketed as the Hungarian suicide song. Within a week, a typist had gassed herself, requesting Gloomy Sunday be played at her funeral. As the death toll mounted, a third verse was added to the song, a happy verse that was intended to counter the depressive urges of the first two. A verse that said, "Wait, it was all a dream, she's not dead, there's no reason to commit suicide, and look, the sun's coming out." It didn't work. The power of Gloomy Sunday wasn't confined to the lyrics. It was the dirge-like melody. As the BBC found out when they banned Gloomy Sunday, but allowed an instrumental version, a recording was made and released on a 78, which caused panic in North London when a woman kept playing the record over and over. Neighbors banged on her doors, the police were called, the door forced open, and she was found dead inside of an overdose. With the BBC, the US, and France all banned the song. Cameron used the grant money to convert the old horse stables behind the hospital into isolation boxes. He also elaborately renovated the basement so that it contained a room he called the isolation chamber. He soundproofed the room, piped in white noise, turned off the lights, and put dark goggles and rubber eardrums on each patient, as well as cardboard tubing on the hands and arms, preventing him from touching his body, thus interfering with his self-image, as Cameron put it in a 1956 paper. But where Hebb's students fled less intense sensory deprivation after only a couple days, Cameron kept his patients in for weeks, with one of them trapped in the isolation box for 35 days. Cameron further starved his patients' senses in the so-called sleep room, where they were kept in drug-induced reverie for 20 to 22 hours a day, turned by nurses every 2 hours to prevent bed sores, and wakened only for meals and to go to the toilet. Patients were kept in this state for 15 to 30 days, though Cameron reported that some patients have been treated up to 65 days of continuous sleep. Hospital staffers were instructed not to allow patients to talk, and not to give out any information about how long they would have to spend in the room. To make sure no one successfully escaped from the nightmare, Cameron gave one group of patients small doses of the drug Curair, which induces paralysis, making them literal prisoners in their own bodies. Realizing that some patients were keeping track of time of day based on their meals, Cameron ordered the kitchen to mix it all up, changing meal times and serving soup for breakfast and porridge for dinner. By varying these intervals and by changing the menu from the expected time, we were able to break up the structuring, Cameron reported with satisfaction. Even so, he discovered that despite his best efforts, one patient had maintained a connection with the outside world by noting the very faint rumble of a plane that flew over the hospital every morning at 9. When my uncle was 4 years old, he and the neighbor's young daughter were playing in the street on a very snowy day in Winnipeg. A snowblower turned the corner, and my uncle jumped out of the way just in time. But the little girl was sucked up and shot out, spewing guts everywhere. My dad, 12 at the time, was walking home from school and saw what he described as ground beef raining everywhere, and found her arm dangling out of a tree. My uncle was so traumatized after the incident, he didn't speak a word for over a year. There is a phenomena on the coast of North Carolina called Seneca Guns. There are sudden booms that sound or feel like a sonic boom or an earthquake, but time and time again, there are no aircraft in the area, nor is any seismic activity recorded. I just discovered the house rattling, like someone had bumped the pylons with their car. When no cause could be found, I went to the internet to look for an earthquake off North Carolina, and that is when I found out about the Seneca Guns. Armin Meuss is a German man who achieved international notoriety for killing and eating a voluntary victim who he had found via the internet. After Meuss and the victim jointly attempted to eat the victim's severed penis. Meuss killed his victim and proceeded to eat a large amount of his flesh. Because of his acts, Meuss is also known as the Rotenburg cannibal, or der Metzgermeister, the master butcher. His main occupation was working as a computer repair technician. The details of this story are not all strictly from my individual dealings with this person, but reflect the story of one man as shared by the recollections of many of my colleagues, each of whom had their own unique relationship with this man. I used to be a telephone suicide crisis counselor late nights and early mornings. I've heard all manner of amazing stories of pain and hope, loss and salvation. We normally never know the veracity of one caller's claims, but that's not the point. We counsel to the situation that caller brings, nothing more, nothing less. One caller that was particularly memorable was of a man who spoke of a curse of causing death by motor vehicle accidents, but not in the way you might typically expect. When he was very young, his mother died in a motor vehicle accident in which he was the only other passenger. His father died a couple of years later in a car crash in bad weather on the way to pick him up from school when he took ill one day. Several years later, his sister was run over in front of him as they were crossing a road and died at the scene. By age 20, his entire family had died in motor vehicle accidents in circumstances in which he was either a witness or the cause of the need to drive in the first place. Heavy going for the poor bloke. So, feeling very alone and downright cursed, he withdrew from all meaningful relationships, convinced that anyone that got close would ultimately die because of him. He had no close friends and minimal contact with the outside world. And it was about this time that he started calling our service for someone to talk to at night. After some good conversations and kind listeners, he finally summoned the courage to get some help to overcome his social phobia through psychotherapy. With time, he even managed to enroll in university and attend a local on-campus residential college. He still kept to himself and called occasionally, but it seemed that he had finally had a trajectory in life. One night, some of the guys in his dorm took pity on him and dragged him down to one of the local college bars and introduced to all their female friends as the unluckiest man alive. I guess they thought it was funny, or maybe thought they could get him sympathy lay, but he was pretty crushed that they betrayed his sad history in such a callous way, and he stormed out, headed back to the dorm, and reverted into isolation. The guys from his dorm, being decent young blokes, apologized for their lack of consideration and made the time and took the effort to show a bit more kindness to the guy. Over a few months, he became part of their group, and for the first time in a long time, felt that he belonged. One winter break, his friends offered to take him skiing on a sort of boys' weekend. He reckoned he was keen, but was just too afraid that something bad might happen since it would involve driving, so he declined the offer. Later that day, the three guys that had taken the time to befriend him were all killed on the way to the slopes when their car was cleaned up by a 4x4 without chains that had lost control and slid across the road into them, pushing their small car up and over a safety guardrail and down a ravine. Poor bugger. He left college, and from that point on, the frequency of calls to us skyrocketed again. He became virtually housebound in his family home. Nonetheless, we had some good chats about the meaning of life and death over the space of several months. And I guess you could say he was a regular that I looked forward to hearing from. He wasn't suicidal or particularly depressed by nature. He had just resigned himself to the fact that he would never be allowed to get close to people for the remainder of his days. But eventually, being a young man in his early 30s, lit a bit of a fire under his arse, I guess, and he managed to go summon up the courage to meet a young lady online. Things went very slowly, and it was several months of emailing and Skyping before they finally arranged a date and met in person. Fortunately, serendipitously even, she didn't die in an accident that night, and whilst he remained understandably apprehensive about getting close, he managed to finally form his first romantic relationship, which was a pretty huge deal. Over the next few months, we spoke from time to time, discussing very real risks and emotional challenges of taking a chance one more time. He really yearned for someone to share his life with, but was absolutely terrified of losing her, and more importantly, of being at fault for it. I never told him my name or vice versa, and I always pretended that I'd never heard his story before, because that's just how it's done with regular callers. But he was someone that I looked forward to talking with because he had real courage, kindness, and depth of character. The last time he called, I was the one who answered. He'd deliberately taken a major overdose and had put steps in place to ensure that emergency services wouldn't be able to get to him in time by going to a remote location. These sorts of calls happen occasionally. It's what we refer to as a goodbye call. Of course, you go through all of the motions, and the team in the background do what they can to try to get the EMS out to his location. But as the counselor, you ignore all that and focus on being with the person. His girlfriend had just been killed in a motor vehicle accident after a drunk driver ran a red light. I stayed with him on the phone until he faded out of consciousness, and we spoke about the sense of peace and release that he was looking forward to, rather than all the pain and loss that had characterized his journey to that point. By the time the police and paramedics finally arrived on scene, after many minutes of dead air, they said that he wasn't breathing and that they had work to do. I let them go about it, ended the call, and went outside and looked at the stars for a good long time. We heard later that night from emergency services that they were unable to revive him, and he'd passed away, and somewhat unusually, they thought that we would want to know. Normally, we never get that information, but I guess the fact that I was on the phone with him at the end made them want to go the extra step to let us know. Ultimately, the human spirit can only bear so much, I guess. And while the role of the suicide crisis counselor is normally about trying our best to listen and place ourselves in the shoes of others in order to try to help them find a way to save their own life, in this instance, that was well beyond my ability. But that doesn't mean that I didn't make a difference in those last moments, like a priest might comfort someone with their last rites. Such experiences and journeys are hallowed spaces, shared between many strangers who walk together from time to time in spaces of deep darkness. That night, my job was about sharing a space of understanding and fostering a sense of peace and comfort at the end. I did what I could, and can only hope that it was enough. A very sad story, and to the best of my knowledge, a true story, shared in pieces to myself and my colleagues over several years. In a very real sense, he was the unluckiest man alive, but nonetheless, I felt lucky to have known him as a stranger. I drove home very slowly and very carefully that night. The story behind Unit 731, a Japanese biological and chemical warfare research and development unit. One example, human targets were used to test grenades positioned at various distances and in different positions. Flamethrowers were tested on humans. Humans were tied to stakes and used as targets to test germ-related bombs, chemical weapons, and explosive bombs. They also did vivisection without anesthesia on men, women, children, and infants. These were solely for experimental purposes, which unfortunately means that almost every single victim died, most often in terrible pain. And since they were Chinese, the Japanese did not even think of them as human beings. One of the 731 facilities was by a lumber mill, and the surgeons started calling the people they experimented on logs. So if they had operated on 2 people that day, and most likely killed them, they would say to their fellow surgeons, "I cut 2 logs today." Unit 731 was one of the most brutal units in World War II, and when Japan surrendered, General Douglas MacArthur secretly granted immunity to the physicians of Unit 731, including their leader, in exchange for providing America, but not the other wartime allies, with their research on biological warfare. American occupation authorities monitored the activities of former unit members, including reading and censoring their mail. The U.S. believed that the research data was valuable. The U.S. did not want other nations, particularly the Soviet Union, to acquire data on biological weapons. And one of many worst parts is that the Japanese public usually depict Unit 731 as heroic, usually denying the things they did to the Chinese people. You know, when you go back and look at post-World War II history and how a lot of what we would consider the axis of evil in the world at the time, their scientists and researchers somehow ended up in allied nations and even heading some very important scientific community research facilities and NASA. So, anyway, pretty interesting who the good guys really are, or who we think they are. Are there even any? An study abroad student came into a university in my city and asked to speak with one of the representatives of their park exchange program. The people at the university had no idea what she was talking about and asked her to explain. Apparently, she signed up for a study abroad program that was in my city. Her job was to work in this little kiddie park with a merry-go-round and sightsee. She was told to only bring $300 to $500 with her for the entire summer. So the administrators asked for her to call the number that she booked through. The man who she booked through was very mad that she didn't wait at the airport for him. She took a cab straight from the airport to the university. Turns out some psychopath was using a well-established university as a front to lure study abroad students from Russia to the United States in order to kidnap them and use them for sex trafficking. They sent the girl back home straight away and reported the incident to the police. Not sure if they caught the guy. The actual story of the crucifixion of Christ. What most people believe is that he was nailed to a cross from his hands and feet, had a beard, and was wearing a loincloth. In truth, he was nailed at the wrists, not the hand. The reason was that the carpals in the hand are not strong enough to hold the weight of the body, and since his arms were holding most of his weight, his shoulder muscles eventually gave out and they both dislocated, placing a large amount of stress on his windpipe and diaphragm, making it near impossible to breathe, which also contributed to his death. Secondly, the beard you see in most depictions was not there. The Romans actually plucked his beard out hair by hair. Also, he did not wear a loincloth. The depiction of him wearing it is just for modesty's sake. Lastly, Christ was almost unrecognizable because of the beating done to his face. On August 2nd, 1988, Stephen Mignona and Michael Gionta, 2 teenagers from near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, went to the nearby town of Irwin. They stopped at a video arcade and met 2 girls, Penny Ansel, 13, and Melissa Baker, 12. They convinced the girls to go back to Steve's parents' house in Trafford, a few miles away. When they arrived at the 5th Street home, Mignona and took Penny Ansel upstairs, and Gionta and Baker chatted in the living room. After a while, Mignona called down and told Baker that a friend needed her, so Baker went upstairs. A little while later, Mignona asked Giunta to come upstairs to help him with something. Giunta entered the bathroom to see the body of Melissa Baker, her throat slashed, lying in the bathtub. She was still alive, feebly moving and struggling to breathe. Giunta ran out of the house and was 5 blocks away, walking across the Trafford Bridge, when Mignona caught up to him in his truck. Mignona begged Giunta to get in the truck. He got in and they drove to a secluded road nearby Monroeville. Giunta refused to help and stayed in the cab while Mignona dumped the bodies of Ansel and Baker, wrapped in black trash bags, over a hillside. Mignona then drove Giunta to his house, let him out of the truck, told him "I love you," and drove back to his own home to clean up the blood. Giunta went to the police. Mignona will spend the rest of his life in prison. He was up for the death penalty, but citing bad influences on his life, his older brother was in jail, he had been molested at age 10, and he listened to heavy metal and read pornographic magazines. He was given life without parole. Steve lived 1.5 blocks away from me on the same street. We rode the same school bus, and we were in Boy Scouts together. He played hacky sack with my friends, and was a pretty normal guy. Despite Tanzler's best efforts, Hoyos died of terminal tuberculosis at her parents' home in Key West on October 25, 1931. Following Hoyos' funeral, which Tanzler paid for, and with the permission of her family, Tanzler commissioned the construction of an above-ground mausoleum in the Key West cemetery that he visited almost every night. One evening in April 1933, Tanzler crept through the cemetery where Hoyos was buried and removed her body from the mausoleum, carting it through the cemetery after dark on a toy wagon and transporting it to his home. He reportedly said that Elena's spirit would come to him when he would sit by her grave and serenade her corpse with a favorite Spanish song. He also said that she would often tell him to take her from the grave. Tanzler attached the corpse's bones together with wire and coat hangers, and fitted the face with glass eyes. As the skin of the corpse decomposed, Tanzler replaced it with silk cloth, soaked in wax and plaster of Paris. As the hair fell out of the decomposing scalp, Tanzler fashioned a wig from Hoyos' hair that he had been collecting by her mother and given to Tanzler not long after her burial in 1931. Tanzler filled the corpse's abdominal and chest cavity with rags to keep the original form, dressed Hoyos' remains in stockings, jewelry, and gloves, and kept the body in his bed. Tanzler also used copious amounts of perfume, disinfectants, and preserving agents to mask the odor and forestall the effects of the corpse's decomposition. In October 1940, Elena's sister, Florinda, heard rumors of Tanzler sleeping with the disinterred body of her sister and confronted Tanzler at his home, where Hoyos' body was eventually discovered. Florinda notified the authorities and Tanzler was arrested and detained. Tanzler was psychiatrically examined and found mentally competent to stand trial on the charge of wantonly and maliciously destroying a grave and removing a body without authorization. After a preliminary hearing, October 9, 1940, at the Monroe County Courthouse in Key West, Tanzler was held to answer on the charge, but the case was eventually dropped and he was released as the statute of limitations for the crime had expired. Shortly after the corpse's discovery by authorities, Hoyos' body was examined by physicians and psychologists and put on public display at the Dean Lopez Funeral Home, where it was viewed by as many as 6,800 people. Hoyos' body was eventually returned to the Key West Cemetery, where the remains were buried in an unmarked grave in a secret location to prevent further tampering. The facts underlying the case and the preliminary hearing drew much interest from the media at the time, most notably from the Key West Citizen and Miami Herald, and created a sensation among the public, both regionally and nationwide. The public mood was generally sympathetic to Tanzler, whom many viewed as an eccentric romantic. Though not reported contemporaneously, research, most notably by authors Harrison and Swicegood, has revealed evidence of Tanzler's necrophilia with Hoyos's corpse. Two physicians, Dr. Depew and Dr. Foraker, who attended the 1940 autopsy of Hoyos's remains, recalled in 1972 that a paper tube had been inserted into the vaginal area of the corpse that allowed for intercourse.